Hello. Um, how you doing? Welcome to this week's masterclass. Let me just turn the sound off on my YouTube here. If you can just let me know you can see me and you can hear me, that would be great. And if you can hear and see Ableton, if someone could let me know that, that would also be great. Let me just get something playing here. So if you can let me know you can hear me, see me, and you can hear Ableton and all that kind of stuff, that would be great. Okay, good man. Thank you, Rich. Okay, so today I'm going to start looking at analog in Ableton, and I'm going to design a drum kit, bass patch, probably a lead patch, and some special effects from scratch. Analog is a great synthesizer for learning subtractive synthesis, and subtractive synthesis is the form of synthesis that is used across all analog synthesizers. So, you know, whether it's a Moog, Electron, or, you know, anything, Juno, all these analog synthesizers use subtractive synthesis. So if you can learn that, you're well on your way for like creating sounds from scratch. Now, like I said, analog is great for learning subtractive synthesis. Once you've learned these techniques, you'll be able to apply them to sampling as well, because most samplers use subtractive synthesis as well. And the thing about subtractive synthesis is it's pretty simple. It's not like FM synthesis, where you know, you have to really know your stuff to understand. I mean, the theory of FM synthesis is not that hard, but to actually program a sound from scratch in an FM synthesizer from your own knowledge is something that requires a hell of a lot of skill and time. Whereas FM synthesis is a pretty simple, subtractive synthesis is a pretty simple way of creating sounds. You have to excuse me, I had my wisdom tooth extracted yesterday, so got a bit of a sore mouth, struggling a little bit today, but all good. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start building a drum kit. So I'm going to grab an analog, which is what I'm going to be using, and I'm going to think about a kick drum. Drop an analog in there. Now I'm just going to use one oscillator here. So I'm going to get rid of the second oscillator, make sure the noise is turned off, and I think for a kick drum I'm going to go for a sine wave. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in a 4/4 kick at roughly the right pitch of I want my kick drum. That's quite nice. Already sounds a bit like an 808 kick already, so let me just put one note in like that, and let's loop that so we get a 4/4 kick drum, and then we can design the sound. Okay, so that's a nice pitch for a kick drum, and obviously you can tune this to your track. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a pitch envelope. The way analog works, it's all in shells, so I click these separate areas here, and that takes me to the shell. Right, so I'm going to put in a pitch envelope first. So that just means that I need to click on this area here, and the pitch envelope on analog is much simpler than the other envelopes. So I'm just going to, if you think about when you hit a kick drum, it starts off much faster when you hit the skin, and then it slows down a bit, so I can emulate that. That's a classic 90s analog kick drum sound there. If I bring that like that, then that's giving me a bit of a click at the beginning. So I could just play around with that to get the sound I want. I quite like that. That's got a nice little click at the beginning. And now I'm going to look at the amp, because I need to look at the envelope of this amp, because at the moment it's a long boomy kick drum. I want to shorten this, so I'm going to bring the sustain down like that. Then I'm going to mess around with this again, just till I get the sound I want. Obviously I'm not going for a realistic kick drum here. I'm going for and maybe if I really wanted to add a bit more thump to it, I could put a second oscillator on and not put the pitch envelope on that, or put a different pitch envelope. I could just mess around. Depends how realistic I want it, but for now I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to actually put the best way of doing this. Okay, so the decay is not really working out for me. I can lengthen the decay, bring the sustain so it's really short. Can have more of a sound like this. So I can really just mess around with this. Okay, so that's quite a meaty kick drum, maybe a bit excessive, so okay, that worked for me. And then I can kind of process it like any other kick drum. You can fiddle around with it for ages just to get it exactly how you want. Maybe that's a bit of an excessive. Maybe that's a bit more of a thuddy kick drum. Okay, so that's good. So next I'm going to look at a snare. So I'm going to drop another analog in. And I am going to use the noise oscillator here to create a snare. You could also do a clap as well if you wanted to go a little bit more advanced, but I'm going to stick with the snare today, and I'm just going to put this classic snare pattern in there. So we have, and once again, I could use, actually on this one, I could use, there's no point putting a pitch envelope on it because the pitch is going to remain the same. If I change that, it's not really going to make any difference. But definitely need to put this kind of envelope on it. Okay, that's very snary already. Could make it a little bit longer if I wanted. Okay, and then I could probably use, if I wanted, a bandpass filter and a bit of resonance. To give it a bit of character there. Without the filter, that's it, that's with the filter now. Turn it up a bit, mess around. So we've got a nice kind of analog sounding snare drum there. And that, now with the hi-hat, I'm going to copy the snare sound actually. And I'm just going to use the white noise, but this time I'm going to use a high pass filter. So let me just put the classic 4/4 snare hi-hat pattern in here, like this. So now I'm just going to turn this filter to a high pass filter. Already sounds a bit like a hi-hat. Nice hi-hat there, and then I can change the envelope of the hi-hat to get a slightly different sound. Or a closed hi-hat, obviously. That's quite nice. And all the classic drum synthesizers use a very similar technique to this. So now I'm going to do some tuned percussion. So with the tuned percussion, I'm going to use the same idea as the kick drum. So I'm just going to copy that out there, and I'm just going to play it up here like this. So. And now I'm just going to change the envelope and the pitch. And that's like an analog tom or bongo, conga. You can hear that it's even sounding. The timing even sounds analog, which is a bit crazy. Maybe because of the beginning of this kick drum. It's taking a while to kick in. Okay, so it sounds like a very basic analog drum machine here, which is a good skills to know. Once you get into your drum machines and your drum machines emulators, what you'll probably have, you won't have the sustain, and the you will probably just have attack possibly, and then decay, and then you won't have release and sustain on most drum machines. So you can shape your sound that way. So that's what those things do. And then you have pitch as well. Okay, so that's a very basic way of making a drum kit. So now I'm going to start looking at some acid bass. So I'm going to go again, create a MIDI track. And I'm going to get an analog again, drop that in. Now the thing about the squelchy analog bass is the first thing to note is that it was a monosynth. So I'm going to turn my voices down to 1 voice. So I need to go into my global area here, which is, hold on, there we go. Unison voices, where are you? What's going on here, mate? Something a little bit strange for me. Voices 8, there we go. Sorry, so we've turned that into a monosynth. I'm going to turn glide on as well because there are 303 glides. That means if you put two notes together overlapping, it will glide between the notes. And I'm going to go for a square wave, which is quite a classic analog acid bass sound. So now we have, as the basic sound, we have. Okay, it already sounds a bit acidy, but we can make it sound even more. I'm just going to go for, let's have a little listen. You can hear that glide effect happening between those sounds because that note is longer than that note, and that's a classic glide. So I'm just going to put one note in with that one glide there like that. So Okay, so that's sounding a little bit acidy already. Now we're going to mess around with the envelope again. So turn that release down. Okay, so it doesn't sound acidy at the moment. We need to put some resonance on that filter and bring the filter down. So put a load of resonance on there. And then we can if you want it to really squeal, you can get it to squeal as well, like the classic. Get it to squeal like the classic, and just mess around with this filter. So 12 sounds better to me. Something else that's going to really help us is a filter on the envelope, so we can put an attack on the envelope, on the filter envelope. Okay, that's quite nice. So that's quite nice acid there. Bit of reverb on it. Bit of delay. And let's get some automation on that here. So I'm just going to go into analog here, go to filter 1 frequency, and I'm going to unlink this and give me a nice little 16 classic rising up. So we've got that looping, we can make that longer. Okay, so next up I'm going to add a pad. So again, I'm going to create another analog here. And I'm going to think about using 2 oscillators for this pad. I want a nice thick pad. Can I have one waveform like that? Where is it? I added that to that. So I accidentally put it over the top of my there we go. classic acid. I accidentally put my analog over the top of that one, which I didn't want to do. Insert another MIDI track here. So I'm going to think about creating something more like a pad. So for this, I'm going to have a nice long attack on this sound actually. We can have different attack times on our filter to our amp, and we're going to have a nice long sound actually. So I'm going to change these so we've got two different waves on each oscillator. We're using two oscillators this time. I'm going to use some unison here and detune them like this, so we already get a thicker sound when we hit this, or if we don't have a sound at all. Okay, and I'm just going to make this last for a long time. Maybe. Let's get this looping, so I'll press play and it just plays, and then we can mess around with our sound. Right, so that's not sounding good at the moment, so we need to do a lot of work. So now we've got, let's listen to that in isolation. At the moment, we've got a long attack on that filter. So when we press play, and then we're going to leave the sustain up, and we're going to have quite a long release on that as well. So get a little bit of resonance on there. Sounds very much like a, I could put a sawtooth on there. I'm going for a nice analog, quite a rich analog pad, but it's not working just yet. Okay, it's sounding a bit better now. Let's get it down here. Little bit of unison on there. Let's get an envelope on our amp as well. Similar thing. We want it to last a long time. Maybe soften that filter. Let's begin to sound a little bit better. Get the resonance down a little bit like this. Okay, sounds good. Still a little bit static, so let's get LFO working on a little bit on the frequency modulation. Nice slow LFO here. It's really slow, and let's have a little bit on the frequency modulation. So I'm just going to turn this up. LFO 1. Turn this up a little bit here, so we've got a little bit of movement there. Add a little bit of vibrato as well. That's beginning to sound a little bit nicer. Still, maybe we can turn the resonance down a little bit more. Okay, so we have a pad, not the best in the world, but let's try that with a chord, using chord. and then put a couple in. Let's make this 4 bars long. Sorry. Let's make this 4 bars long. And put a little pad sequence in here. Nothing too major. Let's try a little chord in there. Let's see. Then 4 bars. I don't know what I'm doing today, mate. I have to explain. Have to apologise. Right, there we go. Let's make these the right length now. There we go. And now we have But now I'm going to put a chord in here, so I'm going to put, let's just put a 5th in there. Okay, so we're getting something which sounds like, beginning to sound like the music of the late 80s when they were, you know, experimenting with these analog synthesizers and creating the first kind of experimental electronic music, or the experimental electronic dance music, I should say. So that's pretty much my demonstration for today. We have built sounds from scratch using analog, which is subtractive synthesis. And if you can get your head around doing this on your analog in Ableton, then that means it's going to make it much easier for you when you buy an analog synth, or you know, you've got an analog drum machine. You'll start to understand how you can start to shape the sound yourself. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Now it's time for your questions. You can ask questions about anything, this, your assignment, anything you want. Yeah, okay, so what I would do with analog quite often, if you've got quite a mid-range bass line, I would layer up a sine wave from analog on top of it. It's quite simple. It just adds, because the sine wave doesn't have any harmonics at all, so it just adds those sub frequencies, and you can always add something an octave down if your bass line's a bit higher up or whatever. So I would just, okay, so look, here's my acid bass here. Hasn't got many bass frequencies in it. So if I wanted to add a subby bass to that, I would copy that out, new analog there. Let's put a brand new analog in actually, in fact. So I've got this second analog. I'm going to put it on a sine wave actually. And then I'm just going to see how that sounds with that bass. Completely wrong here. Okay, so you can hear that's already adding some more subby sounds, but I've got a sine wave, but it's probably a little bit high up actually. So what I'm going to do, we're going to clip here, and gonna grab these here. Oh, it's quite low anyway, so I'm going to try taking that down an octave by holding shift and the arrow down key. Okay, so that's added some lovely sub bass now. Once you've got that, you can just think about, once again, how you want the envelope of that sound. That's just added some lovely sub bass to that. And then you could, if you wanted, okay, that's better like that. And I'm just going to take this note out because I don't want that note subbing up. And now I've just got a nice sub bass, and now I can treat that as a saturator or compression or whatever I want to treat it with. I've got a nice subby. To give my bass a little bit more weight. So that's one thing you can do. Right, so could we, yeah, so we've done that. Okay, could you point out your view of using preset versus designing sounds from scratch? Right, I think most artists are going to probably use a mixture of both. The presets are there for a reason. People have thought hard about the presets, but I would say that presets are normally a good starting point to start designing your own sounds, because they're in the ballpark of how you want your sounds to be anyway. You know, on the old analog synths, you had to design everything from scratch as well, so it depends on you know, what synthesizers you've got. If you're buying analog synthesizers, then you're going to have to design your sounds from scratch. Can you shut the doors, guys? Sorry, getting gate crashed by my kids. Yeah, so you'd have to design your sounds from scratch in an analog synthesizer. But if you buy a synth which has got, you know, hundreds of presets, you'd be, you know, it's at least worth checking them out to see if they work, and then tweaking them. So yeah, it's a balance, I think. I don't know that many artists, apart from modular artists and pure analog artists, that design all their sounds completely from scratch. But at the same time, I think it's good to at least tweak the presets. And if you're coming up with a special effect like an LFO effect or anything like that, then you're probably going to really want to design that from scratch. So if the sound isn't there as a preset, then design it from scratch. So it's balance, I think. Okay, so if you're adding it to an existing instrument, you could do exactly the same as I did there, but you'd use an instrument rack, and you'd put the analog, the sub bass in the sine wave in the instrument rack. Right, so let's look at a preset analog string, and then you can see exactly what's going on here. It's going to be a lot easier than me just designing it from scratch. So let's have a look at here. So analog strings, and then that is a good way of showing how you can design things. Similar to our pad, but we've got quite a lot going on there. So look, analog. So we need a pure string. This has obviously got a lot more than just an analog in here. So we're using a combination of analog and effects to create a string. So more is going on here. You've got the chord thing here, you've got the attack, the release. Right, so let's have a look at this. Let's unpick this out. So you've got two oscillators here, each with their own filter. So you can change here how each oscillator is affected. This is on a 70-30 ratio here. So now this sounds like this. Okay, so that's probably not the best string preset to go through because it's a little bit unusual. So let's go for string, another one actually. Okay, that's good. Let's put that in there. Okay, so again, let's go into the analog here and unpick this. So we're going to double click on here. Once again, you've got two oscillators, both going through one filter this time. So they're both going through filter 1. You can check this here, how much each one's affected by both filters. If you have them both going through filter 1, then this filter affects everything. You've got obviously no pitch envelope. You probably wouldn't want that on a string. Your filter envelope is like this. So you can see that. So it's got quite a long attack, quite a long sustain, and quite a long release, as you'd expect on a string. Now, this is all going through amp 2, which is unusual actually. I'm not sure what the reason is for this. Maybe it's for the unison between the filter and the amp. So here, amp 2, you see an envelope similar to our pad envelope here. Where's our pad envelope? That's our pad envelope. That's our string envelope. So they're very similar, actually. And the filter, the string and the pad are very, very similar because you want that long attack, and you want it to sustain while you hold your keyboard down. And once again, similar to our pad, they've used unison and a little bit of vibrato, and they've also used some glide. So that means it will glide between the notes. But here, they've put two voices at unison. So it's not a monosynth. It's a two-voice synth here, so you can play two notes at the same time. So it's pretty similar to our pad. Once again, they've used one sawtooth and one square wave, and what they've done here, they've actually detuned the oscillators from each other, and that gives you a bit of a thicker sound. So this second oscillator is detuned by 14 minus 14. So yeah, or 0.14 I should say. So similar to what we did with the pad, a few different little tweaks in there, but the idea is the same. You're using a long attack, you're using a little bit of unison, a long sustain, you're utilising the filters a little bit, to shape the sound. And what they've done differently here is they've detuned the voices, and they've used this filter here and this amp here, which is quite unusual actually. So hopefully that explains it to you. Right, okay, so okay, right, so let's go back. Right, so there are sounds that I make using my vocal. How would I go about transforming these sounds to a synth sound using analog? Right, so you so you wouldn't use analog, you'd use simpler. Um, yeah, so you'd use simpler, and simpler. If you look at simpler, or even if you wanted more control, you'd look at sampler, because sampler's got even more control. Sampler for me is like the biggest, most cutting edge 90s sampler you could buy, whereas simpler is like quite a basic sampler. But if you look at the controls you've got even in simpler, you'll start to see that they're very similar to your analog synth. So if I grab a vocal sample and I put them into simpler here, let me grab a vocal here. Probably not the one. Okay, so I'm just going to drop that in very, very quickly. I can, once I edit this sample down, I can start to play it across the keyboard. And then I would tune it the same way as I showed before. So I'd use tuner if it's got enough, as I showed on the previous masterclass, tune it so it's the right key. And then I would just use the envelope and the filter to start to think about how I want it to sound. So let's have a little listen to this. Let's get some notes in there. Maybe put an analog filter on there. So already beginning to get a little bit of a more synthy sound out of that, and then you could start using an LFO on the filter, for example. So you can start shaping the sounds, and that's in simpler. Once you go into sampler, you've got a hell of a lot more controls, and you can start having a lot more fun, like automating some of those controls. So yeah, I mean, you would use subtractive synthesis techniques, the same techniques you use in analog, but you do them in a sampler. So that could be an Ableton sampler or a third-party sampler. But the principle is the same. You're using envelopes, filters, LFOs to shape the sound over time and overall, I suppose. Okay. So voices and polyphony are pretty much the same thing, right? So it's how many, so it's how many notes you can hold down and play at the same time. So so on an old analog synth, they were mono synths. So they only had one voice. They could only, okay, so maybe, it depends on which way you want to look at it, but we'll go into that in a bit more detail, right? So you have one voice on a monosynth, right? That means that, okay, you may have a couple of oscillators, but you can only play one note at a time. If you start playing two notes at a time, then the second note is going to sound and the first note isn't going to sound. So that's where the glide comes into it. That's why you can get cool kind of analog effects by using the glide and a mono setting on a synthesizer. If it's not a monosynth anyway, you can turn it into a monosynth. And that means if you hold one note down and you press another one, it'll glide up to that note because it's monophonic. You can't play two notes at the same time. So polyphony and voices are how many notes you can play at the same time. So the analog synth started becoming polyphonic a bit later, which meant you could play a certain amount of voices at a time. So, for example, my analog 4 is a 4 voice. It's 4 note polyphony and it's got 4 voices. So I can play 4 notes at the same time across the whole synth. That's either one note on each of the 4 sequencer channels or one chord with 4 notes. So I can only play 4 notes at the same time. It's got a 4 voice polyphony. Hopefully that explains it. So unison, right? So yeah, okay. So unison is when you're detuning the voices against each other. So yeah, so you're basically using the two voices, you're detuning them together basically against each other. It's like an automatic detuning. You can do it manually via detuning, but it gives a little bit more beating and weirdness to the voices. So that's what unison is. It's good for thickening up the sound. That's what it's doing. So you're using those voices together. You also got something called paraphonic, which is where you can play. So you've got one filter, one. So you've got one, basically a monophonic synth, but you can play each of the oscillators. So it could be like a 2 voice or a three oscillator, 2 or 3 oscillator synth, and you can play each of those oscillators separately with their own notes per oscillator, but they share a filter, they share everything else, and that's called paraphonic, and you find that on the Korg Volcas and stuff like that. So yeah, voice and polyphony are the same thing. Yeah, so you have voices of polyphony. So yeah, your voice is a measurement of your polyphony. Maybe there is a slight difference, but as far as I'm aware, they're interchangeable. Did you ask me a question, Devon? Yes, that's what I said. Yes, they're basically the same thing. They are. I mean, I think, yeah, it may be a bit different because you may talk about polyphony on a digital synth, and that means, or a digital unit, and that means like drums and everything playing together. Whereas voices is more something you talk about in an analog synth, but they're pretty interchangeable. I think it's basically how many notes or how many things you can have playing at the same time. If I had a Roland MC909, which was a digital, and the polyphony involved samples, drums, and synth voices. So same, but you wouldn't describe a drum as a voice. Although I suppose you do, because we talk about it in the analog rhythm. So yeah, pretty much interchangeable, I think. There may be some small technical difference, but yeah, when people are talking about the amount of voices or the amount of polyphony, it's how many things you can play at the same time. I suppose in a digital world it's different because you're limited by digital, right? So I think yeah, you're limited by the digital power of something, whereas analog voices are actual physical voices. Um, they're physical pathways inside the synthesizer, whereas digital is a bit more kind of computer based. So that's what I would say. So how would you go about creating moving pads? So that's exactly what I was describing. You would put a set, right, so I've got a slightly moving pad. I'd have to go into a bit more detail here. So what I was doing, I was using right, so I was using a slightly different envelope on my filter than my amp. See, slightly different, not massively different. And I was also using an LFO as well, and a little bit of unison as well, and which can create some beating, which is movement. I'm using an LFO on the pad as well, on the filter. If I turn that out more, that makes it move more. So LFO is good for creating movement. I normally have quite a slow LFO on there. You've actually got two LFOs as well, so you could have, if you really wanted to, you could have your both oscillators going through separate filters with different movement on both LFOs to create a little bit more movement going on there. So yeah, it's just using the same principles. LFO and envelopes create movement. They change the sound over time. So that's how you do it. Right. So how far would you go when separating out sounds, i.e., sounds instruments that occupy the same frequencies? Right, so my general thinking on it is okay, and it's unavoidable to have instruments occupying the same frequencies. That's something that's going to happen. It only becomes problematic when it's muddying up your mix, or the things that are kind of hidden in your mix that you want to be a little bit clearer. But as a general rule, your bass drum, your kick drum is going to take up some of the same frequencies um, as your bass line. Your snare is probably based on white noise, so it's going to take up the same frequencies as everything through the mix. Your vocal's going to take up the same frequencies as your synth. So using the same frequencies as each other is okay. People seem to think you have to have everything on its own separate frequency range. No, it's okay to have something sharing frequencies. It's normal. It only becomes problematic if it begins to sound bad. For example, bass lines and kick drums can be a problem because the low frequencies take up a lot more energy. So it's quite easy to use up all that energy straight away and not have a very muddy sounding mix, or having something that just doesn't, your kick drum, you can't get your kick drum or your bass line to cut through, and that's when you'd employ techniques like side chaining, maybe a little bit of EQ and stuff like that. So as a general rule, if it sounds good, that's fine. You only need to worry about separating frequencies when it becomes problematic. That's the way that I would look at it. I like you. Rich, can you show some examples of the error setting in analog to introduce random pitch movement? Okay, so right, this is right. So analog synthesizers are famous, especially the older ones, for not being uh, amazingly perfect. That's one way of looking at it. So what you can do, you can introduce some error. You can either do that manually, um, or you can actually do it. I think you can. Is there a setting, an error setting in here? Yeah, I thought there was in the pitch. Time width, pulse width, subsync. Okay, so there's not a manual error setting, is there? I mean, one way you could do it, right, is you could use, for example, you could use a random note in your LFO and have that really slow and have that changing your pitch slightly. LFO1 is now random. That's slightly changing the pitch and introducing some error there. That's one way you could do it. So you could use a random noise or random waveform, and you could use that to change the pitch of one of the oscillators. That would be the old school way of doing it. So yeah, pinch. So yeah, just a tiny bit. You don't want too much, and that will give you a slight feeling of an analog synth which is detuned. You could also just naturally take the detune down a tiny little bit of each oscillator, and that's going to give you a bit more of an analog detune. If there is an automatic way of doing this, let me know, because I wasn't aware of it. But if that's going to sound a little bit more like an analog synth, because they're not perfect, it's analog. One of the beauties about them is they are slightly detuned. So hopefully that's helpful there. In the master panel. Error. Okay, yeah, so you just put error up and that will do the same kind of thing that I've just done. It's going to basically just introduce a little bit of analog shall we say analogness to a digital synth. So it's going to add, yeah, it's going to change the pitch and maybe a little bit of the timing, and do you know what I mean? Lots of little things like that were never perfect on it, and they're still not really on analog synths. And it's part of the beauty, part of the charm of analog synths versus digital. They're not perfect and they're a bit rough around the edges. Even the Electron Analog 4 and the Analog Rhythm do weird things. They do weird sounds and they do strange stuff because they're analog. And that's just trying to recreate that in a digital world, really. Okay, guys. Well, look, that is the end of today's session. Hopefully, you all got something from it, and you're going to have some fun with some analog synthesis, or apply this to sampling or whatever. But you know, for me, subtractive synthesis is a great way of coming up with lots of different sounds. Very nice analog sounds. Once you start using samples and analog synthesis, you've got a new world of sound design as well. So go away, have some fun, and I'll catch up with you soon, guys. Take it easy.